Revelations.Unveiled.Detroit.
I will never agree with anybody disrespecting the flag of the United States of America or our country. Let me just tell you what I see or what I feel when the national anthem is played and when I look at the flag of the United States. I envision my two grandfathers who fought for this country during World War II, one in the Army and one in the Marine Corps, both risking their lives to protect our country and to try to make our country and this world a better place. And is everything right with our country right now? No, it's not. We still have a long way to go. But I think what you do by standing there and showing respect to the flag with your hand over your heart is it shows unity.
Lynching in America, targeting Black veterans. Fighting for freedom, the Civil War and its aftermath. When 11 Southern states seceded from the Union to form the Confederate States of America and sparked the Civil War in 1861, they made no secret of their ultimate aim: to preserve the institution of slavery. In the words of Alexander H. Stephens, Vice President of the Confederacy, the ideological cornerstone of the new nation they sought to form was that the Negro is not equal to the white man, and slavery and subordination to the superior race is his natural and moral condition. Though Congress officially authorized the Union Army to accept Black members on July 17, 1862, national leaders largely considered the Civil War a white man's war, and the Union was reluctant to use Black soldiers in combat. Northern military personnel, politicians, and President Abraham Lincoln himself expressed fear that armed Black soldiers would ruin white soldiers' morale, harm the war effort, or, as one Ohio congressman warned, prove so essential that victory would weaken white supremacy. If you make the Black man the instrument by which your battles are fought, the means by which your victories are won, the congressman argued in his plea against Black combat soldiers, you must treat him as a victor who is entitled to be treated with all decent and becoming respects. As the war dragged on and the Union incurred more casualties, objections to combat Black troops faded. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, which applied only to those enslaved in the Confederate States, provided that Black soldiers would be accepted into all military positions. The Navy gained 19,000 Black sailors, and 179,000 Black men joined the Army, making up 10% of its troops. Some 40,000 were killed fighting for the Union. Black Union soldiers included men who had been free in the North before the war, Black men who had lived free in the South in the midst of slavery, and some who escaped slavery after the war began and joined the fight in hopes of guaranteeing their freedom and winning that of others. But acceptance into the military did not mean equal treatment. As the war against the Confederacy raged, Black soldiers also had to fight for equal pay and rations that the War Department had promised during recruitment. A black soldier from Pennsylvania reported that his union was overcome with despair upon learning they will be paid less than white soldiers, and many protested on payday by refusing to accept any payment. Despite protests and pleas from leaders including Frederick Douglass, Congress refused to pass legislation equalizing black and white soldiers' pay until 1864. Black participation was far less common, more complicated, and more staunchly resisted on the other side of the conflict. The Confederacy was based on a belief in white supremacy and black inferiority, and a commitment to continue slavery. The Confederate Army refused to enlist or arm black soldiers, even as the turning tide of the war led some Confederates to urge that enslaved blacks should be ordered to fight just as they were ordered to work. Some enslaved black men were taken to the battlefield as servants for Confederate officers, but formal black enlistment in the Confederate Army was prohibited until a desperate and largely inconsequential act of the Confederate Congress authorized black Confederate military service on March 13, 1865, just weeks before the Confederacy surrendered. As Leon Litwack wrote, the historian, few slaves were ever enlisted in the Confederate Army, and none of them apparently had the opportunity to fight. Had the Confederacy managed to raise a black army, it would seem unlikely, particularly after 1863, that it could have fought with the same sense of commitment and self-pride that propelled the black troops in the Union Army. When he first heard of the act to recruit blacks for the Confederate Army, a Virginia freedman recalled he had suddenly found himself unable to restrain his emotions. They asked me if I would fight for my country. I said, I have no country. The Civil War ended with the Confederacy's surrender in the spring of 1865. The formal national or nationwide legal abolition of slavery came in December 1865 with the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which prohibits slavery except as punishment for crime. The legal instruments that ended racialized chattel slavery in America nonetheless did nothing to address the myth of racial hierarchy that sustained slavery. Black people were free under the law, but that did not mean whites recognized them as fully human. Nationwide, but particularly in the South, white identity was grounded in the belief that whites are inherently superior to African Americans. After the war, the whites reacted violently to the notion that they would have to treat their former human property as equals and pay for their labor. In numerous recorded incidences, plantation owners attacked black people simply for claiming their freedom. Many surviving black veterans traveled to the South where they had lived, many in the status of a slave before the war, carrying hopes of starting farms and finding loved ones lost for years or even decades. These veterans frequently faced grave danger from violent attacks and racist laws designed to restore the racial hierarchy. The success of the African American as trained soldiers challenged the idea that black people were only fit for servitude and undermined a central tenet of white supremacy. With their military training, black soldiers represented both a viable alternative source of community leadership and a direct physical threat to white supremacy when they came home. After a brief period, the victorious federal government gave up on Reconstruction and withdrew from the South in 1877, abandoning its duty to effectively protect newly freed black people and enforce citizenship rights they now held. Exploitive systems of convict leasing and sharecropping impeded economic process and returned many black people to the status very similar to slavery. President Andrew Johnson took office following President Lincoln's assassination and adopted views and policies that opposed black voting rights, restored Confederate citizenship, and allowed the Southern former rebels to reestablish white supremacy and dominate black people with impunity.